Well, hello there. So this time it's a different sort of video. What we're doing is we're posing a question, and the question is, what is a classic motorcycle? For example, Debbie's old Excelsior 150 with its Villiers engine. Is it a classic motorcycle or is it just a small, old motorcycle? Now the reason I bring this up is, obviously we make several videos about classic bikes, or what we like to call classic bikes. Sometimes these include bikes like my old BSA Starfire 250 or BSA Bantams, Villiers engine bikes, Italian 175s, well pretty much anything really, right down to mopeds and all the way up to 1000cc V twins. And occasionally we'll get the comment that will say, these really aren't classic bikes. And the kind of bikes that these people often suggest are real classic bikes are almost exclusively the really expensive ones. 68 Bonnevilles, Vincents, Gold Stars, that kind of thing. So this then poses the question, to be a real classic, does the machine have to be rare and above all expensive? Because this doesn't carry over into the car world, does it? A classic car could be a Mini, it could be a Citroën de Chevaux, or it could be a Jaguar or Ferrari. They're all classic cars and there doesn't seem to be any great snobbery about it. Now invariably these kind of comments are often made by people who I strongly suspect don't really ride bikes at all these days. Your typical armchair fantasist who dreams about owning a bike but is too busy reading the book of excuses to come up with reasons why he doesn't ride a bike, but still has a strong opinion about them either way. So okay then, how can we actually define what constitutes a classic motorcycle? It's kind of difficult, isn't it? The best way is to follow what the VMCC do really, the Vintage Motorcycle Club, and they will break a machine down into the era in which it was used, in which it was made. For example, a veteran machine will be something that was used before World War I, typically as a rough guide. With vintage machines being, well, fairly classically, anything sort of after World War I and before 1930, 1931. Bikes after that date tend to be regarded as pre-war, with post-war, surprisingly, being those built after World War II. The real classic era is any bike that really is built after 1950, I would say, as a rough guide. And in general, classic era machines are definitely seen as running between 1950 and say the end of the 1970s into the 80s, although some would expand this into the new era classics, which will run into the 1990s. Which for me is fair enough, these are bikes of now fairly advanced in age after all. But wait a minute, doesn't this pose another little query? You see an awful lot of YouTube videos and articles, fairly typically from, well, American YouTubers, although in all honesty it's not always Americans. British and European YouTubers and other specialists can be just as guilty, and they'll often be restoring a bike from, I don't know, 1975 and describe it as vintage. You'll also see this on eBay and things like that. I've got a vintage CB750. But is this correct? Is a bike of that era actually vintage? Well, I suppose by the VMCC definition, no, it's a classic bike. So you could describe it as I'm restoring my classic 175 or 750, but you really shouldn't be saying vintage. Vintage, of course, suggesting something from a completely different era. But then, in truth, ultimately, does this really matter? I mean, if it's your bike, you can pretty much call it whatever you like, can't you? So then I suppose we go back to the original question. Was Deb's little Excelsior really a classic bike or just an old one? Well, I suppose by the VMCC definition, it is a classic, fits into the right era after all. But also, just because it's not expensive and just because it's not historically interesting doesn't mean the machine isn't interesting in its own right. All machines are indeed interesting in their own way. Every machine is different, especially from those classic eras and beyond. So does a Gold Star count as a classic? Well, yes it does. It is a classic bike and it's a really good one. But that doesn't mean that other bikes are too. And what we like to refer to as our classics really should be independent of just how much we're paying for the thing. So maybe, and somewhat unusually, this is one time where our car driving cousins have actually got it right. And I don't say that very often. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. It was a little different, wasn't it? But don't worry, we'll be back again, producing lists of bikes and of course going out and about and working on our own machines. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching, and see you out there on the road.